So continuing on here with Jim Posewitz, Jim was talking about Cecil Garland and his talents and all the fine work he did. Of course, that particularly includes the Scapegoat Wilderness.
Well, I think the one point about Cecil, the most powerful asset he had is the man had a beauty of expression. I mean, he put things down that came from his soul, and he was so skillful at writing it. His testimony for the scapegoat in front of Congress was sheer poetry. And, I mean, Cecil sort of drifted into Montana, became a businessman up at Lincoln, and developed a true, genuine feeling for the wild land there that no one could express any better than he. So it was a thing of beauty. And in the course of events, why the Lincoln backcountry becomes a scapegoat wilderness. And I think in the course of the debate, there were three guys who either were or would be governor that eventually would issue statements in support of creating the scapegoat wilderness. Prior to the scapegoat, all wilderness that was in the system was put in by virtue of the U.S. Forest Service studying the area, coming to a determination, and then going to Congress and having it put into the wilderness system. For the Lincoln backcountry, it was the first area in the wilderness system where the initiative came from the citizen level, and that was led by Cecil and his ability to communicate.
It's fascinating history about going legislatively back to the many-year process of getting the Wilderness Act actually passed, and ironically, part of that involved compromise with Congressman Wayne Aspinall of Colorado. And during that whole negotiation process, to get the act passed, and because of Congressman Aspinall's activities and opinions, the whole process for getting wilderness designation was changed from being a top-down procedure to a bottom-up procedure, which ironically led to, in this one instance, as you say, the passage of the scapegoat wilderness, where otherwise it may very well never have taken place.
Well, the plan was just the opposite. I mean, the Forest Service came out with a plan to put a roadway up the Blackfoot and I think out to Dearborn to develop the backcountry. And that came as close as the bulldozer being unloaded on the Blackfoot River side up there in the headwaters area to begin the construction. And it was Cecil who had appealed to Congressman Batten to put that on hold. And it was, it was nip and tuck. And I think eventually, as you mentioned, Aspinall had sort of an iron grip on the thing at one section, or one point in the process. And I think, as I remember the story being told, and I don't know if this has been written or if I'm recalling a spoken word, but that Cecil Garland was in Washington and he had cause to talk to Mike Mansfield. And Mansfield was a man of few words. And I think the story was that I heard was that he assured Cecil that he would get the wilderness. And Mansfield was incredibly powerful in the Senate. And later Aspinall said to this person, and I think it again was Cecil, that that's one powerful senator you got there. And so every piece of the landscape has a story like that. And it's great that you're trying to capture those stories, because that is the one component of this whole effort that we can pass to the next generation if we can get their attention. And to tell these stories, I think, would invigorate anybody who is sort of personally disposed to value the things that have been preserved for them.
So about Senator Mansfield, did you have personal contact with him?
No, I did. I think he was, ran in total different circuitry. I was, a state bureaucrat at the time, and he was the leader of the United States Senate. A lot of space in between.
One of the comments that you made that really struck me personally in your book, Taking a Bullet for Conservation, was a comment that conservation and environmentalism is rational. It really is about not only other forms of life, but humans themselves as far as protection for now and for future generations. And I really enjoy that comment.
Well, good. I'm glad I hit the hit the chord every once in a while. You get lucky as a writer.
You did. And that's an easy message, I would think, to pass on to generations to follow. Any other comments that you'd like to say about strong, forceful personalities that you met with on the state or national level, people that just you remember for their strong convictions?
Well, I remember a man named Don Aldrich. And Don Aldrich was the head of the Montana Wildlife Federation when I was just a rookie here, and just moved shortly after I moved to Helena. And I can remember I would go to his house and sit at his kitchen table to get the reassurance that I needed to take on some of the causes we were battling for. Because from within the bureaucracy, that wasn't being nurtured. But I had to find somebody who would express approval of what we were trying to do on some of these various causes and issues and things. And I would find that in Don Aldrich. I mean, he was older than I was by a bit. His son eventually comes to also lead the Montana Wildlife Federation, Tim Aldrich. But I just frequently think back and know that at the time I didn't think that's what I was doing. But in retrospect, I was going there to find somebody who would give some approval to some of the campaigns we were, that I was participating in as a state employee. So that would be one example, I guess. We had a director named Frank Dunkel, and he became the director shortly after I joined the agency, and he was a pretty courageous guy, but he was doing it for wildlife and for fisheries and for political energy, because Frank eventually filed and would run for governor. The Republicans took him out in the primary. He made the mistake, I guess, of filing as a Republican. But there was always action around Frank. And my career basically was launched by Frank, as he moved me up the bureaucratic ladder faster than I should have gone, probably. But I remember with some clarity that when the Anaconda Company went on strike, Frank went over to Forrest Anderson, who was the Attorney General, and he said, I think, Forrest, we should get an injunction that would require the unions to keep their personnel working on the pollution abatement component of cleaning up the Clark Fork River as the water was coming up out of the mines. Now, they had only a kind of a marginal cleanup program, but it involved the fact that you were pumping water out of the deep mines. Otherwise, if the mines flooded, then everything was lost. And so that was a constant maintenance necessity. And there was a component of those union workers that were working on cleaning up that water as best it could be cleaned with the technology at the time. Frank wanted to make sure that those guys did not walk off the job as part of the strike. Went to the Forrest Anderson to get him, the Attorney General, to take that action. And the answer he got, I was told, was that nobody gets between the company and the union when there's a strike pending. So then he kicks it up and goes to the governor, Babcock, with it. And gets exactly the same answer. And so he comes back to the Fish and Game and he says, "Paz, get in the car." And he goes over to Missoula and files the injunction himself. Takes action. And I can remember walking into that courthouse with the union lawyers on one side of the corridor and the company lawyers on the other. And the thing got settled before we ever took it to the crisis point. But to me, that showed quite a bit of courage. And it was an exciting time. He was an exciting guy. And anyhow, that's another example. Mm-hmm. And he was the last director that was hired by the Fish and Game Commission. And then they had executive reorganization shortly thereafter, and executive reorganization turned the Fish and Game director into a gubernatorial appointee rather than an employee of the Fish and Game Commissions. And that, of course, made it directly politically vulnerable. And then it begins a transition in agency activities. It takes about a generation, but that's what happened. And I think that was the sort of the nexus, the seminal moment when the director no longer had any rights beyond just the political appointees.
So you served the Montana Wilderness Association, you served on the state council, and you've been a devoted member for many, many years, I know. Do you have any words for the Montana Wilderness Association?
They're doing great. I have absolutely nothing but admiration for the people that are there now and the people that preceded them. I mean, it's a necessity that in a democracy, the people have got to stay involved. It goes way beyond just casting the vote, your vote of who will represent you. Because particularly in natural resources and wildland values, you represent that resource. And without the NGO movement, the non-government organizations, we'd be in a terrible shape. And historically, I mean, you can see that when we were in our toughest condition in the dirty 1930s, economic depression, drought, Dust Bowl, it spawned a whole generation of non-government organizations. The Wilderness Society, the the National Wildlife Federation, Ducks Unlimited, these guys. And in that era, there was very little professional corporate structure to the non-government world. I mean, these guys were stepping in, many of them unsalaried. The Don Aldridge I mentioned, I mean, he worked most of his career in the non-government world probably without any salary, or at least not a significant salary. Many of them would work for organizations when they could pay about half the wage. I think you look at some of the early executive directors of the Montana Wilderness Association, serving either as a volunteer or as a very marginally compensated individual. They've all strengthened themselves in that regard. They're pretty sophisticated now, and they have salaries.
Because of members like you?
Well, because of members, yeah, right. It's all people investing in things that they value that otherwise would have fallen by the wayside. And I think it's a remarkable endorsement of a democratic culture, or period.
We appreciate your membership and support
Well,
so much. We've talked about other rivers in Montana, Missouri, the Yellowstone. Another river I know that you are intimately involved in is the Kootenai River. And again, it seems like a common thread here, the story of dam builders. And there were battles here on the Kootenai, a river that's a stunning river in its beauty, Kootenai Falls, the people of that area, Libby,
Yeah.
and all the history of that. And wondering about your thoughts and memories of the issues on the Kootenai.
Okay, just after I moved, well, not when I moved into Helena, I was to be the bureau chief for the Water Resource Development Bureau, and that meant we fought to fight the dam builders. Libby Dam was under construction. That question had been resolved. But the minute I got here, became aware of what they were doing to the Fisher River. And I wrote my first nasty piece of conservation advocacy that was published in our Fishing Games publication about the fact that the federal government was not constrained by the Stream Preservation Act that the citizens of Montana passed. It only applied to subdivisions of state government. Well, here was the Corps of Engineers, and they were channelizing the Fisher River, basically totally destroying it, not because the dam needed it, but because they were relocating the railroad off the Kootenai bottom and to go up instead to bypass the dam by going up the Fisher River and then one of its tributaries whose name escapes me at the moment. And so I wrote this nasty piece called Ravage the River and published it because it's all we could do to protest and make it a public scandal what they were doing to the Fisher River at the time. And I remember I had a bunch of photographs and we illustrated them with Lyndon Johnson's quote on the beauty of America and stuff, and the contrast, of course, was so stark that I was pointing out, here's the president saying one thing and here's the Corps of Engineers, one of his bureaucracies, destroying the place. And the comic part of that story is the Corps of Engineers eventually was getting sensitized during that period by the public outrage that was being raised, not just with that one piece, but other things we were doing in other places. And they had contracted with the University of Montana for Dr. Les Pengelly, who happened to be a real good friend of mine, to engage in some sensitivity training, he called it. So here's this classroom full of the Corps of Engineers. And Pengelly has me over to do one of the lectures. But the comic was, Pengelly was a comical, he was a guy with a great sense of humor and a quick wit. And so he was introducing me. And he said, now the title of Jim's presentation is going to be Rotten to the Core. So I remember that quite clearly. And then, of course, the battle over Kootenai Falls, to the re-regulating dam. Of course, the hero there was Pat Williams. And there was another courageous moment where he went down and talked to the people of Libby. And he said, if you want that re-regulating dam, you're going to have to vote for somebody else. Yeah. And Pat Williams did a lot of courageous things in his career.
He was told, I understand, during that time that if you do oppose that dam as the Western District U.S. Congressman at that time for the state of Montana, only the western half, if you oppose that dam, you will lose the next election. But he opposed it anyway.
Yes, he did. And one other time, in fact, I was a member of the Helena Kiwanis. And the issue of that day was oil and gas on the Rocky Mountain front and in the Bob Marshall. And the Secretary of Interior under Ronald Reagan was James Watt. And so we had Pat Williams come down and talk to our Kiwanis Club about that issue. And when he said about seismically exploring the Bob Marshall, he said, "Not on my watch, they won't." He got a standing ovation from the Helena Kiwanis.
Well, yeah. I'm happy to say he's also a part of this history project for the Montana Wilderness Association.
Yeah.
Speaking of wilderness with a capital W, you played a role in the Rare 2 evaluation process. I'm interested in your experiences about all of that.
Well, I don't have much detail in my brain about that, but I think primarily we addressed that phase of analysis by pumping in as much critical wildlife habitat data and wildlife habitat security as we possibly could. If you look at it in retrospect, that was a science-based process. And we had pretty good science that measured the impact of excessive roading into these wildlands as far as elk habitat security and grizzly bear avoidance of these features. And so what we were doing is supplying that information and realizing that the big question was not going to be over the quality of data or even the impact on wildlife, that it had to be the emotional and cultural values that people put on the wild lands. And a lot of these Rare 2 areas lacked, the spectacular rock and ice stuff. And so the argument had to be based, or what we could contribute to the argument was wildlife data. And that was not probably as successful as we would have liked it to have been. Because, here I sit all these many years later, and we still battle constantly to keep those wildlife habitat security standards met by the Forest Service. As we sit here, we're again arguing not about whether those standards worked, but whether they could meet the standards. And the reality is they can't meet them. They're not meeting them. They haven't met them. And now, rather than change their operations, we're in a struggle to prevent their changing the standards. But in the forest that I'm looking at out the window here, they are almost badly compromised.
You were, I believe, for a number of years, the wildlife biologist, the scientist, if you will, for the Bob Marshall area. And during that time, were you able to, and fortunate enough to actually get out in those wildlands to do boots on the ground research yourself?
No.
No. In a word, no.
In a word, no. We took a trip, a couple ride me throughs that were very pleasant and pleasurable. But what we did was we took the data off the shelf that our agency had. We didn't crank up any new studies. I had some people some wildlife biologists that worked on our staff that had been working on the Rocky Mountain front relative to oil and gas exploration. In fact, we were evaluating what was going on with the exploration, and we produced the guidelines for oil and gas on the Rocky Mountain front. And the conclusion to that study was the industry said we can't operate in there under those conditions. And thank God for Gloria Flora, who was the forest supervisor at the time. And I don't know if she, the degree to which she said, okay, then you're done. But she did, in effect, say those leases, we're not going to do it. And those activities don't, line up chronologically one on top of the other. But they went on at, in that same era. And what came of the information we got as we were applying it to all kinds of other activities, including writing the wildlife plan for the Bob Marshall. And those same people who had done the oil and gas studies were recruited to come and help, not help, but actually produce the wildlife plan. And we thought that was a pretty good step. We didn't see much vigor in the Forest Service following through to, say, okay, this is it and this is what we're going to do. And the one point of variance we had is that you can't look at the Forest Service land in isolation. When you're looking at these elk populations that are coming and going into the wild country, a lot of them are transient, and a lot of them have needs beyond the wilderness boundary. And we were making an argument that they had to be included as part of the management program. But I was pretty much just the administrator of the program, the people that were working on the ground on the Rocky Mountain front studies, and they covered the whole spectrum: grizzly bears, big game, mountain goats, upland birds, and other wildlife.
In your book, Beyond Fair Chase, about hunting, and I really think personally it's a book as good or better, more fitted for non-hunters as it is for hunters. You write about physical fitness, muscle power, not motors, for getting around. Things are different from 30 or 40 years ago with the explosion in numbers of motorized vehicles of all sorts. I was wondering if you have any comments about just the actual physical exertion, muscle power experience, and using that in the outdoors.
Well, Theodore wrote a whole book on it called The Strenuous Life. And yeah, I think you compromise the experience if the best you can do is drive around on a machine in pursuit of wildlife. And I think you miss the whole relationship there, and so that's what I was basically arguing in the book, is you just got to get out and do it. And it's not only is it better, more fun, but it's better for you. And now, at this stage in my life, I realize there are limitations. But I'm not going to compromise the country. I'd frequently run into the argument that, well, that was good when I was younger, but now I'm X years old, and therefore I can't go anymore. And in fact, I gave this answer, I think, first to a county commission that was somehow probing our defense of the wild country. And to make the argument that I have to compromise a wild place because I got old would probably be the most selfish thing a human being could do. Because I know that wild country exists out there, I know now at least, because of what all these predecessors in the conservation movement for the last century and a half did. And I know from their writings that they did it for those generations within the womb of time, which was me, and those other two generations I talked about earlier, all on the landscape because of that. And we were all afoot, and I think it was about the most selfish thing a person could do is to humble a piece of wild country because it became too much for them late in life. And I don't see that often. I don't think very many people would make that argument.
It's not about one individual or even one generation.
Right.
It's way beyond that. It's a much bigger picture.
Yeah.
Yes. Why don't we knock off there?